Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's workshop is entitled Pedagogical Strategies, Making History Visible in the Classroom, and features Queensborough Community College faculty members Nicole McClam of Dance and Alison Cimino of English. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we live on the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, psychological, social, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. The event today is part of the 2023-24 Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium, Weaponizing the Past, Art, History, and the Rhetoric of National Greatness. The event is organized by the KHC and co-sponsored by the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Center in White Plains, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, and the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, CETL, at Queensborough Community College. Now, to kick things off, please join me in welcoming this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows, Dr. Kathleen Alves and Dr. Lisa Atik. Dr. Kathleen Tamayo Alves is Associate Professor and Deputy Chair of English at QCC. Her research centers on 18th century literature and culture, medicine, and literary history, and she has recently published in Studies in 18th Century Culture, 18th Century Fiction, Afro-Ben Online, and The Rambling. Her forthcoming book, Body Language, Medicine and the 18th Century Comic Novel, explores how medicine shaped and is shaped by comic language through fictional dramatizations of female-specific medical phenomena such as menstruation, hysteria, and pregnancy. Dr. Elisa Atik is Associate Professor of English at QCC. She focuses on the discourses of power, violence, and marginalization. She has published on the functioning of affect and emotion in Israeli cinema and on the pedagogy of teaching about mass atrocity and violence. Dr. Elisa co-organized the 2016-17 KHC NEH Colloquia entitled Fleeing Genocide, Displacement, Exile, and the Refugee, as well as was a participant in the 2019 United States Holocaust Memorial Faculty Seminar entitled Disability, Eugenics, and Genocide, Nazi Germany, Its Antecedents and Legacy. Dr. Atik teaches classes on literature of the Holocaust, popular culture and literature theory, along with multiple composition courses, and she is currently one of QCC's representatives to the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Council. Dr. Alves and Dr. Atik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. I am so pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Excuse me. Nicole Y. McClam, MFA, CMA, enjoys exploring the awesomeness of dance with her students as an assistant professor at Queensborough Community College. As a professional dancer and performer, she is a founding member of B3W Performance Group and works with Circle O, Kayla Hamilton, and Keith Thompson Dance Tactics. Nicole's research interests spring from her lived experiences. She has presented on dance and motherhood, anti-racist praxis in composition and dance history classes, and zombies. She received her MFA in dance while pursuing her studies in the Laban certification program at the University of Maryland. She earned her BFA in dance performance and a BA in chemistry from East Carolina University. Alison Cimino teaches composition and creative writing at City University of New York, Queensborough Community College. She holds a Master of Fine Arts degree in poetry. For many years, she facilitated poetry workshops for educators through Lesley University's education program, Division of Creative Arts and Learning, where she taught a graduate class on arts integrated learning, the language of poetry. Prior to the pandemic, she volunteered for the College Justice Program, teaching poetry at Edgecombe Correctional Facility. Her poems have appeared in Hunger Mountain Review and other journals. She received a PSC-CUNY grant for poetry in 2017 and 2019. Dr. Atik?
In making history visible in the classroom, deconstructing ballet, Nicole McClam will share her journey with ballet and how it influenced her to adapt her pedagogy to make ballet more accessible to dance students who present a variety of skills and experiences. In making history visible in the classroom, exploring contemplative education and arts integrated learning, Alison Cimino will share how she uses these pedagogies in her composition and creative writing classrooms to engage learners and to reach multiple learning styles. In addition to defining these approaches and their necessity in reaching students in a compassionate and engaging way, Professor Cimino will share how she implements these approaches in an English 101 composition classroom, where students also visit the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and discuss social justice and human rights. I'd like to turn to Nicole, Dr. McClam, for her presentation.
Thank you. Not a doctor yet, but maybe one day. Thank you, Drs. Atik and Alves and the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for inviting me today. And a big thank you to Alison for sharing the space with me. First, I want to begin with a question for everyone that has assembled here today. And that is, when you think of a ballet dancer, who do you picture? And I would like for you, if you are able, to type your answers into the chat. Yay, Misty. Beauty and eloquence. I'll give it a few more seconds and then I will turn back to my presentation. All right, thank you for those who participated. Baryshnikov, yes, he was, and that's okay. He was one of my favorites growing up, actually. And it's actually great, and a shift from the responses that I normally get when I ask people who they picture when they think of a ballet dancer. It's usually someone who is thin, young, able-bodied, a white woman. But many of those descriptors do not fit the dance majors at QCC who find themselves in my ballet class, not because they want to be there, they certainly don't, but because it is required for the major. So this anthropologist, Joanne Keali'inohomoku, in her essay, An Anthropologist Looks at Ballet as a Form of Ethnic Dance, states, quote, "We treat Western dance, ballet particularly, as if it was the one great divinely ordained apogee of the performing arts," end quote. The dance majors are fluent in social dances such as cumbia and salsa, and in street and vernacular styles, but unless they are proficient in ballet, somehow they are not real dancers. And this is the problem. Ballet has become a gatekeeper, an obstacle the students must overcome to be recognized as a, finger quotes, real dancer. The funny thing that Melissa Clapper, a social scientist, notes in Ballet Class and American History is that several important figures in ballet, including George Balanchine, who founded the New York City Ballet, and Agnes DeMille, famous choreographer, believed that ballet had no place in higher education. If you went to college, you'd be too old to dance once you finished. So my goal, in addition to making sense of all these contradictions of who is and who isn't a dancer and ballet's place in higher education, is to make ballet more accessible and less traumatic and hopefully enjoyable for the students. But before I go into my strategies, I need to give you some context about my experiences with ballet. So could you please show slide number 2? Thank you. So my beginnings, these are recital pictures of me and my sister in whichever ballet studio we attended when we were kids. We moved around a lot, so it is different. But as a kid, ballet was just this really glamorous, fun thing for me. As an adult, having studied dance for, I guess, and ballet in particular, coming up on 40 years, what I see when I look at this picture now are 2 young girls whose culture has been sort of pushed aside for another culture. And I see that in the elongated spines, the outstretched arms, the pink tights, which at the time were called European pink or nude, and the pink ballet slippers that don't match our skin tone at all. Those images illustrate the reasons why I teach the way I do, which boil down to ballet's assumed aculturalness and tendency. So when I took dance as a recreational student, there was a little bit of history sprinkled in, but as an undergraduate and graduate student, my dance technique and dance history courses were always separate. And much of this was for practical reasons. But the unintended consequence was I focused on movement mastery, or the what of dance, and fitting my body into ballet, and did not connect to its social or historical context. I didn't realize that what I was doing when I took a ballet class was having a kinesthetic conversation between me and another culture's, in this case Europeans, ideals and worldview. And because of my lack of awareness, I unwittingly allowed my own erasure. And because ballet class has such a clear structure, a codified vocabulary, recognizable aesthetics, it was easy for me to assume it had sprung fully formed and had never changed. When in reality, ballet is a mix of high and low art. It borrows movement from a variety of sources and is quite dynamic. Not knowing this prevented me from realizing my agency, not just in class and how I wanted to approach ballet, but questions to ask it, but also in deciding how ballet could help me be an artist I'd want to watch. Further, ballet's ubiquitousness leads to an assumption that it is universal and acultural. In tendus and tendency, Black dancers and the white landscape of dance education, Crystal U. Davis and Jesse Phillips Fine state that unlike Black forms of dance, such as tap, jazz, and hip hop, ballet is rarely taught as a European folkloric dance. Thus, it functions as a universal movement system against which other forms are measured and defined. And, quote, nearly all higher education dance programs in the United States require ballet and or modern dance technique courses, sending the message they are essential for the professional dancer to be self-realized, end quote. However, dance critic John Martin states in Introduction to the Dance, the term ballet refers to a particular form of theater dance, which came into being in the Renaissance and which has a tradition, technique, and an aesthetic basis all its own. I won't go into the leap of how it was acknowledged as an ethnic form and then is now considered acultural. But the long story short is ballet's cultural heritage and values are revealed in its movement. And every time we repeat a plie or a tendu, we are reifying and reinforcing those values. And though ballet is seen as an international form, on Black and brown bodies, it becomes, again to quote Joanne Keali Nohomoku, a borrowed and alien form, because those bodies disrupt the aesthetic uniformity and whiteness of ballet. And that brings me to the topic of tendency. Another consequence of ballet's assumed universality is the conditional and tenuous access Black and brown dancers are allowed in Western concert dance spaces and within dance education. Davis and Phillips Fine state that whiteness, quote, as an institutional and cultural force is akin to a homeowner that undergirds and regulates the permanent structures of the dance world, end quote. Black and brown dancers then become renters, meaning we don't really belong, but we're welcome so long as we conform. And that means there's an acculturation that has to happen with Black and brown dancers. And that process devalues the knowledge and experiences and sometimes the bodies of those students, which can be at best limiting and at worst traumatizing. Realizing this context led me to culturally relevant teaching. Nyama McCarthy Brown states in Dance Pedagogy for a Diverse World, quote, culturally relevant teaching, a term coined by Gloria Ladson Billings in the 1990s, is a method of teaching that relates to the cultural background of students while also going beyond using content which students can relate. Which relates to students' communication styles and tone, learning style, and cultural beliefs, end quote. So in ballet class, this actually does mean providing the historical and social context of the dance form and finding ways for students to engage with the content on their own. And so I do this in a variety of ways. Recently, one of my students asked me for just an in-depth discussion about ballet's history. They wanted to know where it came from, why it's so prevalent in the United States and elsewhere, who are some of its most notable figures, and what are some of ballet's problems. And because we're preparing for a show and they're super tired from all their rehearsals, I was able to devote an entire class to that discussion. So I introduced them to Mob Ballet, which is this organization that curates the history of Black dancers. And there is evidence that, there have been Black dancers in ballet as early as 1830, though Raven Wilkinson in the 1950s is credited as the first. I introduced them to the Yellow Face Project, an organization that challenges ballet companies to reckon with outdated and racist portrayals of Asians. That comes up every year in the Nutcracker. And I also introduced them to the Five Moons, and they are 5 Native American ballerinas from Oklahoma. But setting aside class time for a full-blown discussion is the exception rather than the norm. Just like my teachers, I face similar time constraints to meet certain course objectives. So usually what I do is I will weave in the history and the social context into the class instruction, usually to help explain movement vocabulary and concepts. For instance, I framed an entire class around vernacular and folk dance steps that ballet has appropriated from peasants and other cultures and stylized to fit into its aesthetic. One student, when I explained the class, had said, "Oh, so today's class is brought to us by the poor." And I was like, "Yeah, it is." Other times, I will demonstrate a movement in a style that the students are more familiar with, such as house or West African or even jazz, and show its ballet translation or contemporize a storyline from classical ballet to help students read its movements, because just about everyone has heard about that dude who cheated on that girl and got caught. Ton of storylines in ballet kind of feature a dude who cheated on a girl and got caught. My goal is to find ways for students to use their expertise as an entry point into ballet. I also include a project or reflective assignment to encourage them to be critical of ballet. I often say to them, it is it's physics. It's not a form that you need to fit yourself into. We're playing around with physics. But one project, what is the ballet translation assignment? So in that assignment, the students had to choreograph 2 versions of one movement phrase. The first version was in their preferred style. The second version was a translation of their initial phrase into a ballet sequence. In addition to teaching their peers both phrases, they also had to write a letter describing the similarities and differences between the 2 phrases. And that assignment actually came out of a life experience I had where I was teaching for an after-school program. The organization that I worked for required that I taught 5 weeks of ballet, 5 weeks of modern, 5 weeks of jazz, 5 weeks of hip hop. But I always lost students because they were just bored out of their minds with the 5 weeks of ballet. So we came up with a game. If you can come up with a movement that I can't translate into ballet, I'll scrap whatever the lesson plan was and you teach me. And so it became a fun competition between me and the students. Another reflective assignment called A Letter to Ballet was inspired by scholar Melanie Bales' essay, Ballet for the Post-Judson Dancer. In her essay, Bales describes the either-or relationship many dancers have with ballet. It is either, a lot of dancers find ballet to be either a fairy godmother or an evil stepsister, and that like there's nothing in between. They either love ballet or they simply hate it, and when they're done with it, they're done. Since taking ballet class is unavoidable for many dancers, particularly in the United States, the assignment was to write a letter to ballet as though it were a person. In that letter, they had to explain how they felt about ballet, fairy godmother or evil stepsister, and explain why. Also, they had to explain how they will use ballet in their dancing and what aspects of ballet they will not continue to use. And the responses that I get from students are really thoughtful and funny, honestly. Ultimately, the point of any dance class is to create thinking dancers, not highly functional zombies, especially if the students want to become viable working artists. Choreographers now expect dancers to actively participate in the dance making process and to know their history so that they can cite their sources. Moreover, teaching about the history disrupts the traditionally authoritarian teaching model that ballet kind of has, where the teacher is like the sole authority and it values this passive compliant student who is considered an empty vessel. And, it allows students to ask questions, specifically why and what if, which I do get quite a few of during my class time. They also learn that classical dance forms are not static, but have changed and continue to change to reflect current cultural mores and tastes. Students can take ownership because they can see themselves in ballet, and they can take ownership of that relationship and its possibilities while we're waiting around for the next Balanchine, who most likely won't be a white guy, to show up and sort of push ballet kicking and screaming into the 25th century. Finally, in Ballet for the Post-Judson Dancer, Melanie Bales cites dance critic Joan Acasella, who states, quote, "Ballet has good digestion. You can feed it almost anything," end quote. Although this quote refers to ballet's ability to integrate different dance styles into itself to evolve, I also see how ballet consumes students and literally strips the uniqueness of them away as they struggle to fit themselves into this form. And so I'll end with a quote from Nyama McCarthy Brown as like this aspiration that I have for my classes. Quote, "As dance educators who seek to build multicultural communities and embrace pluralism, we cannot risk our students thinking that we seek to delegitimize their cultural aesthetic," end quote. And if you would be so kind to, you don't have to show the whole clip, but slide 3, you'll get to see an example of our dance students who are, one is a house dancer in this clip, one is actually a contemporary dancer, and one taught the class cumbia for a choreography project that we worked on. Thanks. Thank you. Because you're just going to see the other side of the same combination. But what I enjoy about teaching the students is, if you think of dance as a language, you get to see their experiences as almost these accents as they explore ballet. So thank you so much for listening. I do have sources that I referenced for the talk. If you need them, I can definitely share them with you. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Nicole. That was wonderful. And thank you all for having me. Thanks to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and to the invitations by Kat and Aliza and Marissa and Laura for helping to organize all of this. One of the great joys in doing this and preparing has been in meeting Nicole McClam, and we met on campus. It was the first time I was ever in the physical education building, and I've been at QCC for, I think I'm in my 7th or 8th year. And so I was thrilled to be on the other side of campus and to meet you, and time just flew by in speaking with you. And I said after I walked away, but I truly mean it. We're our students, and we are all very lucky to have you at QCC. Thank you so much. I'm struck by the similarities in what we are preparing today, because there's the language of dance and the language of poetry, and what they have in common is the arts integrated and bringing in the arts. And it's such a privilege to be here to talk about making the past visible in the present through creative expression, in a time where there's so much suffering in the world and in our own communities. If you think of the students we see every day, I think it's important to acknowledge that fact. And my hope is, in sharing some of these teaching methods and pedagogies of arts integrated learning and contemplative education, that these practices may be of benefit. So when working with English composition and creative writing students, I try to remember that many students are carrying the weight of past and present sufferings. And at times, the class may be a break from the burden, but also, if integrated correctly, if acknowledged, it can also be a source of transformation, where making art out of suffering moves it beyond the personal towards healing, empathy, and interdependence. So despite the challenges our students face, there's so much resilience and compassion. So I start here. While we have students of diverse ages at QCC, many in my classroom are recently out of high school, and yet they've seen so much. And I've been privileged to hear personal stories of survival and courage. And I think for all of us who teach writing especially, we get to hear those stories, and it's very fortunate for us. So we bear witness to their resilience. And while I'm grateful my own education path had so much privilege, I'll often share with students how, as a college student myself, my first semester of college, I struggled to concentrate because my mother had died 1 month in. And I'm very touched today that some friends of mine who met me when I was 19 at that time and became heart parents to me are here. So thank you for being here today. Why start there? Because we all carry something around with us, and the body remembers.
Sometimes we may not even be aware of how the body reacts. Maybe our shoulders are hunched up or we're slouched over. But if we can bring awareness to our own selves, we can also bring healing and relaxation. So what does suffering have to do with teaching painful history? In acknowledging what students know, we can make space for learning, empathy, and growth. So the first step is in checking in with ourselves. My colleague, who I'm happy to see is here today, Dr. Joanne Chang, has often said in mindfulness meditations that we should start with a body scan, because if you can relax the body, then you're also open to relaxing the mind because of their connection. Where are we holding tension? Offer it breath. Even as we sit here, if you just relax your body and open your chest and maybe even take a deep breath, you feel different, I would assume. And even just when you feel the tension, inviting a smile can relax some levity into yourself. So I also think of something my teacher, Jetsun Kanja Rinpoche, a Buddhist teacher, had said, that relaxation is the ultimate form of compassion. And that's compassion for ourselves and for each other. So it's really important to have that relaxation. So some of the things I'm going to go over today with you is, how do we make past visible in the present? And much like Nicole is using culturally relevant, culturally responsive pedagogy, I tried to bring that in as well. So recognizing students' strengths and experiences, acknowledging suffering and sharing your story, connect with the breath, use arts integration, make a body-mind connection, create a safe pathway, and invite creativity in play. So these are some of the things I'll be sharing. And I love this, no mud, no lotus, the idea that the lotus is grows out of mud. And so both suffering and happiness are an organic nature, which means they are both transitory. They are always changing. The flower, when it wilts, becomes the compost. The compost can help grow a flower again. Happiness is also organic and impermanent by nature. It can become suffering, and suffering can become happiness again. And this is by peace activist and monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away a few years ago. So culturally responsive education advocates equity and social justice by valuing students' cultures and identity, and valuing who they are, what they already know, coming from rather than a deficit model, that they actually have lots to share and experiences and courage. And so having them tap into that. Many of our students are multilingual. And so really valuing the strength that they bring and to support them. Contemplative education is using mindfulness. How do we bring in the breath and mindfulness techniques to raise awareness and allow students to make connections in learning, giving them the space to focus by slowing down the moment through breath and awareness? Mindfulness meditation is really any activity that brings awareness. So a mindfulness practice can even be done walking, that if you're bringing awareness to your walk or to your breath, you're using mindfulness. And that developing that awareness can also help people to learn to develop space to work with their thoughts rather than being overwhelmed by them, feeling like they're real. Arts integrated learning is attempts to introduce various art forms, the written, spoken, visual, auditory, and somatic, through visual art, poetry, storytelling, music, theater, dance, across curriculums. And this was something early on in my career as an educator. I had the opportunity to teach a poetry class to teachers and educators through Lesley University. And one of the things I was so lucky to encounter at that early stage of teaching was arts integration. And for me, as somebody who has always had trouble connecting with my body in a sense that I'm in my head a lot, that connection with somatic movement, kinesthetic learning, understanding that we can learn through play, through movement, was really big for me as an educator and also as a person, that when you open the body, you're also more open to creativity, and that you are also actively making connections between the body and the mind so that you then remember things as well. So I'm very grateful to have worked with so many wonderful Lesley University faculty in my past. Why arts integration? The idea is that using the arts can connect students to higher learning, and students of any age, and I said myself included, that when we do things and perform a movement, it helps us to remember. When we bring in the arts, we can also connect to a larger framework beyond just the fact of a history, the stories that are told. My students, when they go to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, my 101 students, they often say that the benefit of going there and hearing the stories of the survivors is that it brings history alive and they make a connection beyond the textbook. And I think that's powerful and true because of the arts as well, that there is something in telling our stories and in listening that really helps people. And so I always think of how to sneak the arts in, recognizing that there are multiple types of intelligences, and using these to connect with students. But today I'd like to focus on the somatic movement. I'm not a dancer, and yet I've learned a lot through what I've been able to use with little body movements and bringing that into the class from an arts integrated perspective. And the goal of that is to help to raise awareness. And I think this is definitely the time. In this Learning Through the Body by Tammy Frailer, she says, simply stated, embodied learning involves being attentive to the body and its experiences as a way of knowing. And part of that is even just bringing in our own awareness. So how do I do that in a 101 classroom? I'd like to highlight for you a couple of different activities that hopefully you might be able to try in your own classroom or try for yourself. One of the things I do early on is we talk about the shape of an essay. Here is the shape of a 5-paragraph essay. And I actually have them, my students, mimic the movement of the 5-paragraph essay. And so part of the way that I'm teaching with arts integration and with movement is to think, how can I sneak this in, or how can I introduce them to it? So we actually do the shape of an essay. We say we start off broad, and then we get very specific, and then we open out. And the idea is, in doing the body movement, it's memorable, if only for the fact of having an instructor ask you to do that. So these are some things early on that I do, so that when we get to the Universal Charter on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN, that then we're ready to really do some more movement and body-mind connection. I love this reading because it affirms our interconnection, and it affirms our humanity and the value of that. And this is a reading that we do prior to going to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and visiting. I ask students first, what of all the articles that are there, which is their favorite? And we talk about those. And then afterwards, I ask students to take the one pith idea of it. As a human being, I deserve dignity and respect. And then each person in the room has to say it and do a body movement. And we've done this standing up in classrooms. I've done it sitting down, depending on the class and how they are feeling, what mobility issues we have in the classroom. But the idea of having them say it in their voice, the class then has to repeat it their way and do their movement, so they get it reflected back to them. And each time I've done it, I feel it's very powerful and memorable. Some students say it very softly, and some students maybe even fold their arms. Others, I've had them dance, I've had them move, I've had them do a power movement. It really just shows so much of their own individuality and affirms our deserving of dignity and respect and just the humanity of that. I've had students also, when we talk about this, say, because this is something that we also do. The other piece of this is Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King, which, of course, because I'm teaching rhetoric, is the piece to teach, aside from social justice and talking about how we protest and use our voices nonviolently. And so, but in talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I did have a student say, we don't have that here in our country. And I said, yes, you're right. The Charter was created in response to the Holocaust and offers a document of affirmation and ideals to strive for. But we must remember to fight for those ideals. We must remember we are part of the human family. I also think that this piece is such a nice one for us to use as it connects to something that I learned when Marissa Hollywood shared through the KHC seminar that I took at the KHC of safely in, safely out, that you really want to make sure that when we're teaching difficult subjects and something like genocide and atrocity, that we're also giving a place where students can feel safe and have a way of also touching their own resilience and courage and hope. Here we have the art piece in response. Not sure how many people know this is there, but at the Cortlandt Street subway station at the World Trade Center, the Declaration of Human Rights is written on part of the subway platform, and it was designed by Professor of Art Ann Hamilton. The other piece that I do with this in getting students to talk about their own experiences is in the process of teaching this, the next step after the UN Charter for Human Rights is to talk about King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And we write an essay, which I took from another professor, and it was in taking his letter to then also use his letter, but apply it to a contemporary issue. So students write about LGBTQ rights, ending police brutality, creating safe and human rights in immigration, having safe and clean water to drink, and applying those ideas from King onto today's issues. And that also gets them thinking about it and talking about it. They use a New York Times article or equivalent to in connection with writing about King's letter. After that, we also write poems. And so there's several different exercises that I have them do, even though it's an English composition class. They have one creative writing assignment that I ask them to do. It's a low stakes assignment, but it gets them writing and it gets them looking at their writing from a different perspective. One easy way to connect that I really enjoy doing is having them write about their hands. And any object would do. They could write about something they're wearing or something that belongs to them. But a hand is great because it's just right there with them. And so I ask them to take a few moments, spend time looking at it, and then write from there and see where the mind goes. And that in following the thought and following the mind, they then come up with description moving through experience. And it's really interesting how these exercises work, because whatever they're thinking about, the prompt gets them to move beyond that. And then the idea of the object also comes into the poem, which creates a sense of unity. But what's good about it is that it also allows them a moment to express themselves within the classroom. So all of the things that we've been talking about and studying about, we come back to them as a way to share. So in arts integrated learning and contemplative education, we consider how to make a body-mind connection. How can I do that? Where can I bring in the arts? How can I get students to actively engage with the material? What movement or form will serve as support to the idea or the concept? Keep referring to that movement and idea when discussing the concept, and remembering learners are body, mind, and spirit. So here I have some of these thoughts of steps. Again, this last one, invite creativity and play. This is another thing that kind of goes along with movement. And I think it's really important that students also see us being able to be relaxed, playful, sometimes silly in moments, in that even when we're talking about serious subjects and serious experiences, that there's a way of inviting play in by just also letting our guard down and being relaxed. Inviting play. For me, that sometimes comes in with just doing a toss. I have this little stuffed animal thing I bring in and we toss, and sometimes brainstorm in my English 102 class, literary terms, literary devices. And just that sense gets us away from the paper, gets us thinking and connecting and remembering and memorizing. So coming back to Thich Nhat Hanh, if we take care of the suffering inside us, we have more clarity, energy, and strength to help address the suffering of our loved ones and the suffering of our community and the world. If we're preoccupied with the fear and despair in us, we can't help remove the suffering of others. There is an art to suffering well. If we know how to take care of our suffering, we not only suffer much, much less, we also create more happiness around us and in the world. And I'd like to end with a quote and then a poem. When advocating for the arts, I like to think of what poet Jane Kenyon says in her book, in her book, 100 White Daffodils, her essay, Thoughts on the Gifts of Art. And she says, we cannot afford to ignore our inner lives, our imaginations. For when we do, we become capable of extreme cruelty and destruction. Tenderness towards existence is what the poet Galway Cannell's lovely phrase is what we lose when we lose art or when we fail to value it properly. And so I'd like to just end with a poem that I use with actually my English Composition 2 class. This is a poem in translation, the poem In the Midst of Life by Tadeusz Roswich, translated here. I'll skip saying the name, though I did practice. But the poem itself, I think, to just give you a little background in it, was written after the Holocaust and is written in response to devastation and destruction. And he says, After the end of the world, after death, I found myself in the midst of life, creating myself, building life, people, animals, landscapes. This is a table, I said. This is a table. There is bread and a knife on the table. Knife serves to cut bread. People are nourished by bread. Man must be loved, I learned by day and night. What must one love? I would reply. Man. This is a window, I said. This is a window. There is a garden beyond the window. I see an apple tree in the garden. The apple tree blossoms. The blossoms fall. Fruit is formed, ripens. My father picks the apple. The man who picks the apple is my father. I sat on the threshold. That there is an old woman who leads a goat on a string, is needed more, is worth more than the 7 wonders of the world. Anyone who thinks or feels she is not needed is a mass murderer. This is a man. This is a tree. This is bread. People eat to live, I kept saying to myself. Human life is important. Human life has great importance. The value of life is greater than the value of all things, which man has created. Man is a great treasure, I repeated stubbornly. This is water, I said. I stroked the waves with my hand and talked to the river. Water, I would say, nice water, this is me. Man talked to water, talked to the moon, to the flowers, and to rain, talked to the earth, to the birds, to the sky. The sky was silent, the earth was silent, and if a voice was heard flowing from earth, water, and sky, it was the voice of another man. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for those fantastic presentations. I feel like I learned a lot and enjoyed a lot just listening. We'd like to welcome questions, I think, into the chat. And as those questions come in, I just wanted to maybe kick things off by asking the both of you about when you do these exercises with your students. I'm wondering if you give them the reasoning behind the methodology, right? The same conversation we're having here. Do you share that with the students, your purpose behind all the work that you're doing together?
Yes, mainly because a lot of our students, a lot of the dance majors, I will say, have no experience with ballet prior to QCC or very limited experience with ballet. And they are going to transfer. They usually transfer to predominantly white institutions where I went to one as an undergraduate and as a graduate, and I kind of know the environment. You've got the girls who started ballet as an embryo and have gone all the way through, and their hair is like in the perfect French twist. They've got the pearls, and then there's what we call intima stretching in dance, where they'll sort of come in with their very razor thin cheekbones and sort of like stretch, and it freaks the students out, because they'll go to an audition for, say, Rutgers or Montclair, and they'll come back and they're like, I know ballet, but they got to the ballet part and I didn't know anything. And so I do tell them, look, it's so that you can survive in these situations, because it's not brain science. Like, it's not brain surgery. We're not curing cancer. We're just dancing. And if I can teach you sort of like the movement concepts and the most common, again, using language as a metaphor, sentence starters, because ballet has a lot of common transitional movements. And I was like, this is a sentence starter in ballet. You should know this. Then students are like, oh, you did this. They see these connections, especially when, because I have a lot of house dancers in my class this semester. And I was like, okay, let's do a jack. Oh, yeah. Now take out all the seasoning, but leave just salt. That's a plie. They're able to see those connections, and then ballet is not intimidating for them anymore. It is just movement with a particular style overlaid on top.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I also tell my students what I'm after. I think for me, it's because I'm somewhat a little self-conscious when I ask them to move, that I also want them to be aware that there's research-based method. It's a research-based method. Same with arts integration, that that they're in good hands and that it's safe. And I wanted to share that I had a student years later, I ran into a few years later, and she said, "Do you remember that weird thing you made us do where we had to move because Whitman is a body poet?" And I thought, oh my gosh, they remembered that that's how I taught Whitman. And I made them say, I celebrate myself and sing myself and move their body to that line. But she remembered that Whitman's the body poet. So I was like, yes, it worked. So I think if anything, it does make them more engaged and somewhat memorable. But I think it's important to share what you're doing and why. I believe it's helpful.
While we wait for questions in the chat, first of all, thank you. Your presentations were so informative. I have so many thoughts, but I wanted to comment on and ask perhaps the common thing I find between the both of your presentations. I don't know if it's resisting, disrupting, subverting the Cartesian duality, right, of the mind body, and how the body is a means of epistemology, right? It is through the body we can create knowledge. We can discover knowledge in that way. And what I found too to be interesting between the both of your presentations is that there is the theme of suffering. Nicole, I'm sorry. I don't know a lot about ballet, but I do know that from the popular media I've consumed is that ballet is suffering, right? It's suffering. I've seen pictures of ballerina feet.
Oh, I'm so sorry. They are not pretty.
They're not. But from that suffering, there is this beautiful art that's created, right? But then it seems as though you're trying to destigmatize that, like it doesn't necessarily need to be suffering. And Alison, you're emphasizing, I think, with your students that suffering is in its own way transitory, right? Especially with this no mud, no lotus sort of sensibility. And so I just wanted to ask you if that is how much this idea, because like you began the talk with, like how there is so much suffering today, with it being an election year, especially. So you think you could both of you can expand a little bit more on this?
On the concept of suffering, or?
Sure. Or like, for you, what I also find interesting between the two of you is that, and Alison, you didn't really talk about this necessarily, but I can imagine some students might be very resistant to this. It's not what they've experienced. Your pedagogical approach is not what you've experienced. I've tried mindful breathing exercises in the classroom, and I closed my eyes doing them because I didn't want to see my students maybe being cynical about it. So it like spared my feelings. So, just like how were they at the beginning of the semester? And then how are they at the end?
Well, of course, thank you so much. Yeah, I think, of course, you have to always work with the class, right? And of course, in an online, fully asynchronous class, that's difficult. I still invite them to try the exercises of movement, and then write about it to see. But I think it is important to also share your own experience somewhat. I think also because it's a writing class, that, when you share even a little bit, they will get ideas, but also be willing to share their own stories and maybe even be vulnerable. But there's always that resistance. And I do advocate always to respect the boundaries. Mm-hmm. If a student is resistant, I don't push it. ever, but I invite. And that's the difference. And I think that's important to say. I think also in sharing some of our experiences, and I loved that Nicole shared the picture,
Yes.
her and her sister as a little girl. I think what it shows is that we're also people.
Yeah.
And for me, when I was 18 and lost my mom, I just would have loved to have known another woman who had that, because at that early point in my life, I didn't know many people who had gotten through and gone to college and had a life. And so I think also in us sharing these experiences, it's just to say, you're going to be okay. Like, you're going to get through this. Life is going to have so many different things that you can't even imagine. And hopefully that feels hopeful. But I see that in them too, where they have already had many experiences that I will never have. And when they share, they feel, I think, so heard and valued. And that gives them some more, they inspire themselves. I think that's the other reason for talking about suffering and acknowledging that, but definitely respecting people's space.
Yeah. In terms of, you said something about sharing your experiences, and I definitely do that because with my undergraduate experience, I went to school in the South. I was one of two Black dance majors, but the only Black woman for like the first 3 years that I was there. And I let them know it's not necessarily kind. BA programs are kinder than BFA programs, but I was called, like, all the women were called Cupcake with this one teacher. But then at a certain point, I was called Hershey, and how I felt proud. I know. No. Like, now I'm like, it's problematic. But at the time I was like, I'm not Cupcake. I've been distinguished from Cupcake. I'm Hershey. But how that is ultimately harmful. And usually the suffering that I see with students is, I don't have the turnout. My leg doesn't get this high. I'm not thin enough, or I'm not fill in the blank enough for ballet. And I have to remind them, up until the 1990s, it was in poor taste for your leg to get too high. Prior to Balanchine, which a lot of women, when they die, are going to have a talk with this man, dancers were bigger because the muscular strength required to do ballet, you needed a bigger person. And just, hearing that, as well as knowing other, that other people have gone through it, they're like, oh, okay, I don't have to have my leg at up to my ear. I don't have to spin like a top. And I was like, no. And I often tell them, in my 20 plus year dance career, only once has someone asked me to do a double pirouette. And I joked and said, I get paid per revolution. So, and that, like, sort of ended the conversation. But I also remind them that, dance is it's a physical practice, and they have to be willing to be uncomfortable, usually physically, hopefully not emotionally. I think the field has, not in all the ways, but has shifted a bit to something that is more care-based, particularly with I don't want to say the rise, because disabled dancers have always been there, but just now that we're seeing more dancers with various disabilities as dance makers, we are seeing this change of, we're going to care about the people in the room, and we're going to meet the people where they are.
I love the way you both invite students to be creators, and to take their difficult knowledge and to take their suffering and produce from that. And I think that's something that translates across discipline. And something that I think is applicable to all of us here in this room is the way in which your strategies, I think, really inform this idea that our students are the producers of knowledge, and that that's what we can work with as faculty, irrespective of the topic. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think also I did want to add that it's it's not about emphasizing suffering.
Mhm.
Because I think there's also been a kind of trend of late with the word trauma becoming more popular. Like, let's talk about it. Let's write about it. And I don't do that. I think that can be a difficult approach and invasive to students' privacy. But I think, especially like in the beginning of a 101 class, if they want to write in a journal, that the journal is private, giving them opportunities to explore sensory details, to explore description, to explore their experiences, to connect with literature in a personal way. That is always an option too. Did you want to share that?
Yeah, appreciate that as
We-
well. I think that's important.
We have a question in the chat. Alison, could you talk a little more about student responses post-visit to the KHC? Did they understand why they visited as part of an English class? Did they make the connections to materials you were covering in class, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yeah, thank you so much. I also saw there was a question about from Meg. Thank you so much about do I collect testimonials? And I don't really collect a lot of the testimonials. I'm really not a scholar, and I've shied away from IRB and that kind of thing, if that's kind of where the question is going. But I have asked them to write about their experiences in informal journals in the class, just to check in and see how it's going for myself. And with that in mind, I've also had them writing about the experience post visit to the KHC. And that particular class that I took this semester, I also have them in the following class, which is in English 99, the support class that goes with 101. So we did talk a lot about their experiences and write about it. And every student was moved. They felt like it was important. They felt like it created an understanding. I did have a student who didn't really know much about the Holocaust at all, who that was important that she learned. And that usually there is an experience of that where every once in a while I'll have a student who just didn't know the details or the experience. So I think it's really important to do that. So they also kept, because I was asking them to write a review of their visit as a way of making it a 101 assignment, they noted the care in the curatorial aspect of it. I know Dr. Carrie Lane put that together with the help of everybody there. And they mentioned to see the artifacts and even the stones that they said, like there's this, the way it looks like the walls and the stones. And they said, you really felt like you were there for a minute to experience that and imagined what it was like to be in that experience. And in doing that, making connections to their own experiences and understanding. So I think it's a wonderful resource. They really responded so well to that.
So there's a question for Nicole. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation about the exercise you do about ballet being able to represent all of history. Could you explain that a little bit more? It sounds amazing.
Ballet representing all. Oh, I think going through all of ballet history, is that what you
I think maybe if I remember correctly, your presentation provided like some a more nuanced view of ballet, maybe demonstrating or teaching students some of the underrepresented histories of ballet that are that add more of a richer history that includes Black dancers.
Yeah, that was in more of a that was like the lecture that where we took a whole class period. But for that I do go into like sort of the broad overview of ballet, where it started off in Italy as this court spectacle, and it was literally this dance of that was a status symbol. If you were in the dance, you were like in the in crowd, and how once it moved to France, Louis XIV used it as a political weapon against his courtiers, because if they're too busy dancing, they're not going to overthrow him. And just sort of how it bounced around the world. But once it got to the United States, it also has sort of like a patchwork history up until maybe the 1950s. And, in terms of dancers of color, I do talk about how George Balanchine, to his credit, wanted a fully integrated school and dance company, but because of the laws, the segregation laws in the United States at the time, he could not have that. But he was able to bring in dancers like Arthur Mitchell, who then goes on to start Dance Theater of Harlem. There's George, I believe his name is George Lee, who's like the first Asian American who danced with New York City Ballet. And but also saying, like, everybody talks about Misty Copeland and she's great, but she's not the first. She's the first for American Ballet Theater, which is huge, but she's not the first principal dancer. There's Lauren Anderson. There's everybody in Dance Theater of Harlem. Don't forget about them. There's, and then I mentioned Raven Wilkinson, who was with Ballet Russe, and how she was a beautiful dancer, very talented dancer, but when they traveled through the South, it got really dicey for her, because she wasn't someone who was willing to. She was light enough to pass if you looked at her askance, but she wasn't willing to say that she was white. She was always going to say she was Black. And so, there were moments where she got like the group gets run out of town, or she couldn't perform. I also talk about the history of brown and blackface in ballet, and how it is still a discussion. Because on the one hand, you do have, Mod Ballet and Project Yellowface, which are like, this is wrong. But then you have particularly the old school ballet companies, like Paris Opera is one who's like, well, we can't get rid of it because it's part of our tradition. And what that means to show those stereotypes on stage, because it's not, it's not a book, it's not an artwork. You can't like just put it aside. You are literally embodying it and presenting it to an audience. And the Nutcracker is not the only one. I talked about La Bayadere, which is set in India, where the corps de ballet is literally painted brown and wearing this sort of diaper costume, and it's just really hard. Just when we talk about it, like, it's a beautiful ballet, and it's really crappy what they do and how they portray their idea of India in this like exoticized way. And Petrushka, which features a black a Moor, but the way that they're painted in blackface. So we do get into that. And at one point I did have an assignment of that really went into ballet has this problematic history. If you were the artistic director of a company, what would you do? Would you keep the ballet as it is? Would you change it? Would you toss the ballet? And if you keep it, what would your program note for the audience be? Like, what would you say about this? And some of the students were willing to take on the challenge of like, well, I would adapt it, and here's how I would adapt it. And a lot of students were like, well, it's wrong. The ballet goes. But yeah, it's still a thing. But the Nutcracker tends to be like the biggest culprit because it comes around every Christmas. It is, as I've mentioned to the ballet students, it's a cash cow because kids are in the show. And ballet, just like symphony and orchestra and opera, what we call the SOB in the arts, but to stand for them. But some of us are like, it also means SOB the other way. We know that the experimental, the newer things that artistic directors are really interested in don't necessarily bring butts to seats, but the Nutcracker will. Madame Butterfly does. Certain, orchestras do, even though they have problematic histories. And so how do we address that? And then as you going out into the world, if you are a dancer in this, do you swallow it? I mean, it's because I'll talk about, there's certainly been moments where, hey, you're Black, you can do this. Sure. Yeah. I need the paycheck. So let's go with that idea for now. But I do try to also talk about bodies, because a lot of the dancers' bodies are curvy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just, explaining that, yeah, I was in a ballet class a couple years ago, and the ballet teacher patted my butt without my consent and said, you're gonna have to tuck that in. I was like, tried tucking it in for over 40 years. Was not successful. It's not going anywhere. But just how to sort of survive that, get around that, and explain to them your butt is not a problem. What we're looking at is your anatomical alignment, which is your pelvis. and these are the anatomical landmarks you need to look for, so that when you encounter a teacher who says that, you can say, no, thank you. That's kind of long-winded. Sorry. I hope I answered your question, Marissa.
Not long-winded at all. Thank you for your answer. It also reminds me of the fact that I learned very recently, maybe in the last couple of years, that when the Nutcracker was performed for the first time, it was wildly unpopular.
Yeah.
So I was like, really?
Yeah. It's in the ballet canon. It's not a great ballet. We all know it. Well, within ballet, we all know it, but we're just like, it brings in a lot of money. Let's do it.
But as you were speaking, I was thinking that that's like the perfect example of why we need arts integrated learning. Because without understanding the history of ballet, how to really understand our present moment, and if you're teaching history, to bring in then dance, or to bring in and to invite other art forms, we're not in our little silos. We are always experiencing all of these things, and the past affects our present moment. And getting back to, I think, Marissa's original question, the students in my class end up talking about the UN Charter for Human Rights basically all semester long, because it becomes a touchstone. And in writing their essay about Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, that's it. It's like they own it. We all deserve dignity and respect. We are part of the human family. And I think that's one of the things I love so much about QCC is our students get that, like they understand it in their bones for the most part. Yeah, I think I did want to just talk about that connection too that Nicole made about the language of dance, and that the other really wonderful thing about SWIGs, students working in interdisciplinary groups, or working with people outside of your course, is that you also gain the vocabulary from that discipline. And that I did a SWIG with poetry and a dance professor, Carrie Stern, in the past.
Yeah.
And that was wonderful, because all of a sudden there were all these great verbs and action movements that I could ask students to integrate into their writing, and a whole vocabulary. So I just wanted to say that as well, that there's a wealth of other things to include with arts integration.
I just want to echo that, because I've done collaborations with dance as well, and particularly with dance and poetry, as like overlapping genres and forms of narrative more broadly, again, kind of trying to take it across disciplines and not just, siloing into the humanities. And I think when you kind of break down the various pieces and the way in which it's all a language, right? And it's all a form of communication of ideas, you really get students then taking those skills and applying it. I mean, what can it be applied to a biology class, a computer science class, or anything else, right? It is all part. This is what arts integrative learning is all about. And no matter how complex the subject, right, breaking it down into its component parts and into its linguistic elements, I think is a fundamental thinking skill.
Yeah, there are people, there are some papers I've read of medical students writing haiku as a way to remember
Yeah.
some of their material. So I think it's helpful.
Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. I've learned so much. I will do yoga after this, so I'm going to take the lessons from both movement and breathing. So thank you.
Thank you
Elisa,
so
any
much.
additional comments?
No, just again, thank you to Alison, thank you to Nicole. Just really grateful to have shared this time with you and for all the information that I learned so much from. And also thank you to Laura and Marissa always for just making everything happen and for making this space for all of us to learn. So I'm really appreciative.
So much.
Yes, thank
We're
you.
very grateful. I also took a tremendous amount away from Alison and Nicole, your presentations, and Eliza and Kat, your comments, and Marissa, the questions. And I think that really these days, just given how tough politically the climate is, I think we spend a lot of time at the KHC thinking about what it means to remember, but what it also means to be relevant. And I think right now more than ever, how we help students, especially who are the history of the Holocaust is so long ago for them. And it is such a powerful example of just how societies can really descend into madness. And how and why is that relevant now? And it's not just about retelling the stories of the past, but helping students and community members come in and really wrestle with things that are happening today, because this is really ultimately about creating an inclusive democracy and an inclusive society. And the more that we can embody that for students, the campus and the external community, the better we all are. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. We hope you I always get this messed up. We hope you stay safe and well. Thank you.